Hello and welcome to Africa This Week with me, Ayo Johnson. This show looks at the affairs of the African continent, from news to politics to culture and community initiatives. This afternoon we'll be starting off with the week's headlines, with a discussion on Sudan's President Omar Al-Bashir's escape, having been arrested of war crimes which took place earlier this week. We'll also be reviewing articles on the news stories in relation to the media and the African diaspora. Lastly, we'll be looking back at the Day of the African Child, which celebrates every single year. But first, on Monday, the UN made fresh calls for Europe to tackle the migrant crisis. Our reporter Adama Munu has more on this story and the rest of the week's main headline news.
The UN rights team called for the European Union to take bolder steps to address its swelling migrant crisis, insisting the bloc could easily take in 1 million refugees. This comes as surging numbers of migrants risk their lives on rickety boats to reach different parts of the world. There was recognition the EU has the ability to tackle the problem.
States need to reclaim the mobility market by offering better mobility options than what the smugglers are offering. During the 50s and 60s, millions of Africans and Turks crossed the Mediterranean to find jobs in Europe. No one died, there was no smuggling. There were border controls everywhere, but the general framework was one of facilitated mobility solutions, such as easily accessible visas and cheap ferry tickets.
More than 100,000 people have made the perilous journey across the Mediterranean to Europe so far this year, and some 1,800 have drowned trying. Mozambique commemorated the 55th anniversary of the Mugabe massacre, a historical event igniting the liberation struggle of this old Portuguese colony. The service took place outside a monument to the victims of the massacre, and Mozambican President Nyusi laid out flowers and addressed the crowds that were there.
Celebramos hoje a data em que neste lugar compatriotas nossos foram brutalmente massacrados.
There were also theatrical performances reconstructing the event where Makonde nationalists demonstrated demanding independence from Portugal. The administrator later ordered the leaders arrested and the crowd protested. The country will celebrate 40 years of independence on the 25th of June. Chad said on Thursday its warplanes bombed Boko Haram positions in neighbouring Nigeria to avenge Monday's twin suicide bombings in the Chadian capital of N'Djamena. Monday's attacks on the police headquarters and a police academy in N'Djamena left 33 people dead and more than 100 wounded. No group claimed responsibility for the attacks, but it is believed to be the first offensive on the country from Boko Haram since its lead role in a regional offensive against the group. The government also announced it was banning the face veil in all places in a security clampdown following Monday's attacks. Chad's military vowed it would continue its pursuit of Boko Haram. Sudanese President Omar Al-Bashir escaped an arrest warrant by the International Criminal Court during the African Union summit last weekend. The ICC's requests to the South African authorities to detain Bashir for human rights abuses fell on deaf ears, but the South Africa High Court agreed with the arrest warrant. The arrest warrant came as he attended a summit of African leaders in Johannesburg in South Africa. The African Union chairman, Zimbabwean President Mugabe, discredited the authority of the ICC in Africa.
This is not the headquarters of ICC anyway. And we don't want it in this region at all.
With Bashir having arrived safely in Sudan, this raises the question as to whether the ICC's authority is waning in Africa. Adama Munu, Africa This Week.
Joining me in the studio to discuss the story is Maddy Crowther, who's the researcher from the organization Waging Peace. We also have George Shearer, a Zimbabwean political analyst and critic. And on the line we have Hilary Stauffer, who's an international lawyer and visiting fellow at the London School of Economics and at the Centre for the Study of Human Rights. Thank you all for coming in. Maddy, firstly, what do you make of the fact that South Africa has released Bashir? What does that tell you between the relationship between Africans and the ICC?
I mean, first off, from our perspective, it was a real shame that Bashir slipped through the cracks again. It was something we were expecting almost as soon as we got the news on Monday, but it was a great disappointment. I think obviously it reflects on wider relationship between the ICC and African leaders. And I make that point about African leaders quite specifically because I think a lot of the commentary we've read so far has been talking about it from the elite perspective. And has been talking about African perspectives in that sense. But I think what we're hearing, we obviously talk to a lot of Darfuri refugees and wider refugees from the rest of Sudan and asylum seekers. They're all talking about more ICC proactivity, more Western engagement. That's kind of the message that we're getting. And there's quite a lot of evidence to say that there's this strong African voice that does support ICC engagement in the continent. But I think more generally, it tends to be taken into the kind of wider context of ICC versus African Union.
Well, I'll tell you what, let me put this, George. We already know that the African Union chief, Robert Mugabe, who's the president of Zimbabwe, says that the ICC is not welcome in Africa.
A lot of international organizations, historic, whether it's the ICC, the IMF, the World Bank, the UN, have come under scrutiny from the global south. It's not what they're intended. They've shifted what they are seen as having shifted from their intended purpose to becoming extensions of Western foreign policies. And that's the central criticism. And I think the challenge for the West in that regard is to relook and focus on what its credible agenda is. That's the argument. So the context in which one should read that remark from either President of Zimbabwe or anybody else is precisely to do with what's become the untenable relationship between these international Western organizations and their blind spot, if you like, sometimes, about atrocities within their own backyard. And they are seen to be concentrating on the continent, and they become to be seen as simply conducting a witch hunt. And that's the argument.
Well, hold on to that, a witch hunt. Hilary, I've got you on the line. Do you think that the ICC is fit for purpose? Is it an effective organization?
Well, the ICC is complicated because it's only been around for 13 years. And so in the vast arc of justice, that's actually not very long. It has been plagued by rumors of inefficiency. And, of course, there is this focus on Africa. But that's actually more procedural. Many of the cases that are before the ICC right now have been self-referred by African countries. So African countries have invited the ICC to take jurisdiction over the cases that they're currently considering. So to say the ICC is unfairly targeting Africa is just not really factually true, although it makes a very good headline.
Well, Maddy, I put this to you. Bashir is claimed or is accused of human rights abuses. Remind us, what are those abuses?
So he's accused of 5 counts of crimes against humanity and then 2 of war crimes. And then later 3 counts of genocide were added to that. And that's essentially for orchestrating attacks against civilians and committing a genocide against the mainly sort of black African tribes by Arab militia, for instance, the Janjaweed in the Darfur region. So that's what he remains accused of. And sort of a side point to that is people can talk about the genocide as if it was a thing of the past, but just this year, the UN's released figures saying that since January, 209,000 people have been displaced, adding to, or sort of making 2.5 million in the total, total in Darfur now. So it's very much still going on.
George, just a lot of things still going on, as Maddy's explaining to us there. But are you of the consensus, or what's your feeling about the bigger powers to play, the World Bank, the UN, or the global figures like the United States of America's president, not to mention Europeans? What is their position on this?
Well, nobody's pursuing the Tony Blairs of this world, the George Bushes of this world, the Netanyahus of this world, the Henry Kissingers of this world. And it's precisely for inaction on those questions, okay, including the continuing precarious instability in the Middle East, if you like, which one, of all intents and purposes, is triggered off by, not only, but triggered off in some respects by Western interventionist policies. Now, the world knows that. The inaction on the West to listen to that argument is what's making the ICC ineffective. So it's not because those genocides are acceptable, far from it. It's because of inaction on the West in looking at themselves and wanting to see those international organizations as extension of their foreign policy, which hinders that work. It's been a call ad nauseum to reform those institutions so that they take into account the perceptions of the global South, so that we can all globally feel protected by them. And that's the argument.
Well, that's a very solid argument. Hilary, you are an international lawyer. You know the legal frameworks from top to bottom. Tell me this. Do you think that the ICC, with the accusations that they're only going in terms of a witch hunt against African leaders, do you think that they can shrug off that feeling that people have about them? Do you think that they have the capacity to do that?
Well, they certainly do have the capacity to do that, but the problem is international justice just moves very slowly. And so George's concerns are very valid. It's just not the way that the world works. The world works very slowly in international justice mechanisms. So the ICC is currently considering taking jurisdiction over some cases in South America and elsewhere, but they're not going to get the Tony Blairs and the Henry Kissingers and the George Bushes of the world, because the court's jurisdiction is not set up to retroactively look at those cases. And so while the calls may be very valid that it seems too focused on the global South, the fact remains that many of the conflicts happening today are in the global South. And so that may be why that's where the court's looking.
Well, let me put this. So, Maddy, the ICC is reflective of the wars, the anguish, the disappointments, the failed governments, which are very much in the South, in Africa. That's why its focus is there. Do you subscribe to that?
I mean, to a certain extent, yes. They've obviously gone after the biggest cases of human rights abuses that came up after the court's jurisdiction became applicable, so after 2002. Having said that, they are starting preliminary investigations into other regions, so it's not true anymore, or it might not be true in a couple of years, that every indictment that they've given is to an African leader or somebody who's committed a crime there. So I definitely think it is capable of changing, perhaps a little bit more optimistic than Hilary on that point.
Well, George, I know you're eager to jump in, but in addition to that, just tell me this. He who pays the piper always calls the tune. These are Western developed organizations. Do you think that their biased stance occasionally gets the better of them?
The United States is not even a signatory of the ICC.
Well, tell me more.
And that is a critical point. The United States is the most powerful. It sees itself as an enforcer of everything on the planet, but it's not a signatory to the ICC.
But can they then point fingers at African leaders to say, you are wrong, you're a bad man?
It directs the way in which the ICC makes, but it doesn't want the ICC to put its spotlight on it. That's the point. Nobody pays spotlight on Israel. That's going on now. I would like to see these countries and their presidents, their leadership, pursued with the same vigor as pursued on African heads of state. And as long as there is that disparity, it won't cut ice as most of us.
Well, Hilary, you've got the best legal mind in here right now. What sort of pressure can be brought to bear for the ICC to look beyond the African quarters into other areas of the world for which many people think other leaders should be held account?
Well, there's lots of options available, but I have to push back briefly on what George said, because membership of the ICC is voluntary. These African countries have voluntarily ratified the Rome Statute and chosen to submit themselves to the jurisdiction of the court. So it's not just that some Western-backed organization is hunting them. They were part of the negotiations in creating the court, and they agreed to be a part of it. So it is true that right now it seems skewed against the global South, but it's just not true that this is some Western witch hunt. I would have to push back on that.
Not a Western witch hunt. Clearly an ICC that's been created or supported by Africans who've signed up to it, be that the US has not. What's your final take on this entire equation in terms of how disappointing it sounds?
I mean, I'm not going to fight back on the argument about double standards. I can fully understand that, given that the US is not a signatory, that it concludes decisions with other states to make sure that its own military can't be subject to the rules. That does smack of double standards. I can't really deny that. I guess my final take on everything is it's important to put the victims foremost in this. We talk to them every day in our work, and what they're saying is they completely support the ICC indictment against Bashir. If you go to any demonstrations that we help organise or are present at, the call is always Al-Bashir to ICC, as well as 3 of his other cronies who are indicted as well. So I guess my point would be there's no credible reason that the victims' voices shouldn't actually be of paramount importance in this.
Maddy, you could not have said it any better. I'm sure we'll return to this topic in the near future. An intriguing discussion indeed. Thank you to all my guests for coming on, but we'll be going on a short break. Do not go anywhere, as we'll be having a review on the news. See you shortly after this.